right, let's get into it. Today, we're basically becoming archaeological detectives. In our case, it's one of the world's greatest ancient cultures, the Harappan civilization. Now, their story isn't written down in books we can just pick up and read. No, it's pieced together from the clues they left behind. The bricks, beads, and bones. So let's grab our magnifying glasses and start digging.
Okay, so where do we even begin? Our first clue is this. Take a look. This is the Harappan seal, probably their most distinctive and most mysterious artifact. It's usually made from a soft stone called steatite, and you can see this beautiful, detailed animal carving. But the real mystery is right above it, that line of script. Here's the crazy part. For almost 100 years, the smartest people have tried to crack it, and nothing. We still have no idea what it says.
And that is our central challenge, isn't it? If we can't read what they wrote, how on earth are we supposed to tell their story? How do we figure out who they were, how they lived, what they believed in? Well, it turns out the answer isn't in their words. It's in what they built.
And believe me, what they built was on a massive, massive scale. So we're going to zoom out from this tiny, mysterious seal and look at the absolute genius of their cities. This is our first big clue about just how organized their society really was.
Just look at this map of Mohenjo-Daro, one of their biggest cities. This was not some village that just grew organically over time. Oh no, this was a planned metropolis from the get-go. You can clearly see the two main parts right here. You've got this smaller, raised area, called the Citadel, and then this much, much larger section down below, the lower town, where most people lived. And this is where the evidence for some kind of powerful central government becomes just undeniable. It wasn't just that the cities were planned with these neat grid-like streets and massive platforms. Get this, the very bricks they used were standardized to a precise ratio. Now think about that for a second. The exact same size of brick was used across a huge area, stretching all the way from Jammu down to Gujarat. That implies a level of planning and communication that is, frankly, just staggering for the ancient world. Their engineering skills were, wow, just remarkable. Up on the Citadel, you find these huge monumental structures like the Great Bath, which was probably used for some kind of public rituals. But you know what's even more impressive? The genius you couldn't see. They built the ancient world's most sophisticated drainage system. Every single house was connected to covered drains that ran under the streets. Every single house. And look, this wasn't just pretty good for its time. The archaeologist Ernest Mackay, one of the first to excavate Mohenjo-Daro, put it perfectly. He called it, and I quote, the most complete ancient system as yet discovered. To give you some perspective, this level of public sanitation wouldn't be seen again in many parts of the world for literally thousands of years. It's just mind-blowing.
Okay, so we've seen the big picture, the grand city plan. Now let's zoom right in. Let's talk about the people themselves. What can their everyday objects, the bricks, beads, and bones, tell us about their daily lives?
So how did they feed everyone in these massive cities? Well, the answer is agriculture. We see art like this terracotta bowl, which tells us they knew the animal really well. Archaeologists are pretty sure they used oxen for plowing. And we've even found charred grains, so we know they were growing wheat, barley, and lentils. And of course, the bones tell us they kept cattle, sheep, and goats.
But they weren't just farmers, not by a long shot. These people were master craftspeople. I mean, just look at this incredible variety of beads. They made them from beautiful stones like carnelian and jasper. Some tiny settlements, like a place called Chanhu-Daro, were almost entirely dedicated to craft production, like little factories just churning out these gorgeous objects for trade. And you can see their tech skills in their metalwork too. They were working with copper and bronze to create tools just like these. These were the very implements that built their world and created all those amazing crafts we were just looking at.
Even really simple, everyday objects give us such powerful clues. These are grinding stones, or saddle corns, and they are found everywhere in huge numbers. This is direct physical proof of how they process their food. It tells us exactly how they turned all that wheat and barley they harvested into flour for their daily meal.
So here's a big question. Was everyone in their society equal? Well, to figure that out, archaeologists look at how different objects are distributed. They look for things that were rare or really difficult to make, like these little pots made of a material called fance. These are considered luxury items. And guess what? They're mostly found in the big cities like Mohenjo-Daro, which suggests there was probably some kind of social hierarchy. Some people were richer or more important than others.
All right, time to zoom out again, because the Harappans weren't just living in their own little bubble. Nope, they were major players in a vast, interconnected world, an ancient global network of trade and exchange.
This map just shows their incredible reach. They set up settlements way outside the Indus Valley just to get their hands on resources. They were getting copper from Oman, beautiful shells from the coastal areas, and that precious blue stone, lapis lazuli, all the way from Afghanistan. This wasn't just simple trade. This was a complex, long-distance supply chain.
And this is where we get a massive breakthrough. Remember that script we can't read? Well, we can actually use another civilization's writing to help us out. Texts from ancient Mesopotamia talk about trading with a far-off land they called Maluha. Now check this out. Look at what they say they imported from Maluha. Carnelian, lapis lazuli, copper, gold. These are the exact same things we know the Harappans were making and exporting. So it's pretty much certain Maluha was the Harappan region.
And if you need visual proof, here it is. On the left, you have a classic Harappan seal with its famous humped bull. And on the right, this was found thousands of kilometers away in Mesopotamia. It's a cylinder seal, their style, but it's carved with the exact same bull motif. This is the smoking gun, people, undeniable proof of contact between these two great ancient civilizations.
But this, thriving, sophisticated, and globally connected civilization, it didn't last. And this brings us to our final, and maybe the greatest mystery of all. What on earth happened to them?
So for about 700 years, during what we call the mature Harappan period, their cities were flourishing. Everything was going great. But then, around 1900 BCE, something started to go wrong. And by 1800 BCE, most of these great bustling cities have been completely abandoned.
And the evidence for this collapse is crystal clear in the archaeological record. The unique seals, the script, those standardized weights, they all just disappear. Long-distance trade completely dries up. You can even see the quality of the buildings going downhill. The whole urban way of life just fizzled out. Now, there are a lot of theories, climate change, rivers changing course, but honestly, no single reason seems to fully explain the collapse of an entire civilization.
But wait, the story doesn't end there. Modern science is now giving us some absolutely startling new clues. What you're looking at is a burial from Rakhigarhi in Haryana, which is actually the largest known Harappan city. And just in the last few years, scientists have managed to extract ancient DNA from these very skeletons, opening up a whole new window into the past.
And the conclusion from that DNA research is, well, it's just stunning. The civilization collapsed, yes. The cities were abandoned. But the people, they didn't just vanish. Their DNA shows a direct, unbroken lineage to the majority of people living in South Asia today. So, in a very real way, the Harappans are still with us. So we've come full circle, right back to that enigmatic script. This here is one of the longest inscriptions ever found, discovered at a site called Dholavira. It looks like a giant signboard, right? It's a message from 4,000 years ago, a message we can see so clearly but still can't comprehend.
So think about it. Modern science has found the people. It's connected them through an unbroken thread of ancestry all the way to today. We are, many of them, their descendants. But their voices, their thoughts, their stories, their beliefs, they're still locked away in these ancient symbols. So the ultimate question for our investigation remains, what secrets are they still waiting to tell us?
Imagine finding a message from the past, one that's been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years, but no one on Earth could read it. What secrets would it hold? Well, in this explainer, we're going to find out. We're about to unlock a lost world. You say, all across ancient India, there are these incredible pillars and massive rocks covered in a mysterious script. For centuries, they were just there. By the 19th century, whatever they said was completely lost. The messages were silenced. They were this giant subcontinent-sized puzzle, holding the key to a whole chapter of history. And then, someone did. And cracking that code, it wasn't just about solving a linguistic puzzle. Oh, no. It was like opening a time capsule. It resurrected entire empires. It gave us the names of forgotten kings, and it opened a direct window into the life of ancient India. So how in the world did they do it? How is this ancient code finally broken? Well, it's a fantastic story of some serious detective work, a couple of lucky breaks, and one really, really brilliant mind. The big moment, The real turning point comes in the 1830s. Now, people had been working on this for decades, European scholars, Indian pundits, but the guy who finally cracked it was James Prinsep, an officer working at the East India Company's mint. He was the one who finally figured out Brahmi, the script used in most of these inscriptions. And the way they did it was so clever. Prinsep and his team essentially worked backwards. They took scripts they could read, like the Devanagari script used for modern Hindi, and just meticulously compared the letters to the ancient Brahmi characters. It was a slow, painstaking process of finding similarities and patterns and just piecing together the ancient alphabet, one letter at a time. For another script called Kharosti, they got a huge break. It was basically their version of the Rosetta Stone. See, they found these coins from old Indo-Greek kings that had the ruler's name written in two languages, Greek, which they could read, and Kharosti. So by matching the names like Apollodotus, they could figure out the Kharosti letters. That was the key that unlocked a whole other set of inscriptions from Northwest India. Okay, so the code is cracked. What's the first big reveal? Well, the inscriptions kept talking about this great king called Piyadasi, which means pleasant to behold. For a while, nobody knew who this was. But then they found other texts that used that same title right alongside a name people recognize from Buddhist stories, Ashoka. And just like that, the mystery was solved. The author of all these messages was one of the most famous and important rulers in all of Indian history. All of a sudden, these aren't just carvings on a rock anymore. They were historical documents. And they started painting a picture of a political landscape that was way more complex and competitive than anyone had realized. What they revealed was this land divided up into 16 powerful kingdoms, known as Mahajanapadas. And this was a time of intense rivalry. We're talking fortified cities, professional armies, and constant maneuvering for more power. So, with all these kingdoms fighting for the top spot, why did one, Magadha, end up dominating? Well, they pretty much hit the jackpot. They had incredibly fertile land, which meant more food. They had iron mines for better tools and weapons. They had forests full of elephants, which were basically the ancient world's tanks. They had the Ganga River for easy trade and transport. And to top it all off, they had a string of super ambitious and frankly ruthless kings. And the rise of Magadha wasn't just about one kingdom winning out. Nope. It was the beginning of something much, much bigger. It was the birth of India's first great empire, the Mauryan Empire. This empire was founded by a guy named Chandragupta Maurya way back around 321 BCE, and it was absolutely vast. But it was his grandson, Ashoka, who really left his mark, literally. This map is incredible. It doesn't just show territory. Each one of those dots is the location of one of his inscriptions. He carved his messages in stone for everyone to see, from modern-day Afghanistan all the way down to southern India. And this empire wasn't just big, it was spectacular. The Mauryans created these stunning stone sculptures, like this famous lion capital. Now, this isn't just a pretty piece of art. This is a statement. It's a powerful, polished symbol of imperial authority that just screams power. And it's lasted for thousands of years. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. Ashoka's inscriptions show he was way more than just a conqueror. After a horribly bloody war to take over the kingdom of Kalinga, he seems to have had a total change of heart. He actually carved his remorse into stone for the whole world to see, talking about his pain at the slaughter. This one act completely changed our understanding of ancient power. It revealed a king who publicly rejected violence and decided to spend the rest of his life promoting Dhamma, a kind of moral, righteous way of living. Of course, empires rise and they fall. After the Mauryans, new rulers came onto the scene, and to prove they were in charge, they came up with some new and, let's say, even more dramatic ways to project their authority. Take the Kushan Empire. Their strategy for looking legit was bold. They basically decided, why not just become gods on Earth? They built these colossal statues of themselves and stuck them in shrines, completely blurring the line between king and deity. It was a pretty clear message. Obey the king, obey the gods. And this propaganda even made its way into your pocket. Kushan rulers put their own faces on coins, right next to pictures of gods, and even took on the title Devaputra, or son of God. A bit later, the Gupta kings took a different tack. They just issued these spectacular, incredibly pure gold coins. The message there was a bit more direct. Yeah, we're rich, unbelievably rich, and we're in charge. Okay, we've talked a lot about kings and gold, but history isn't just about the people at the top. While all this empire building was going on, life for ordinary people was being totally transformed, especially out in the countryside. It really came down to three huge innovations that just supercharged farming. First, the iron-tipped plow meant farmers could dig into tougher but richer soil. Second, paddy transplantation, which was back-breaking work, massively increased how much rice they could grow. And third, new irrigation systems like wells and canals meant they weren't totally dependent on the monsoon rains anymore. But here's the thing. This new prosperity wasn't shared equally, not even close. You started to see a much more divided society. Down in the Tamil-speaking South, for example, a clear hierarchy developed. You had the powerful landowners, the Valalar, at the top, then the small farmers who worked the land, the Uzavar, and at the very bottom you had landless laborers and slaves, the Adimai. All that extra food from the farms had to go somewhere, and it fueled the growth of new towns and bustling cities. They popped up all along these critical trade routes, connecting the subcontinent like never before. They became these vibrant hubs for merchants, for craftspeople, and for new ideas. So, we've seen this incredible story that the inscriptions tell us, but it's just as important to stop and ask, what don't they tell us? What are the blind spots in this history that's literally written in stone? For everything they show us, inscriptions have some serious limits. I mean, for one, letters can be damaged or faint. Sometimes we're not even 100% sure what a word meant back then. But the biggest problem is bias. They only record what the elites, the kings, the wealthy, thought was important enough to carve into rock. Grand victories, big donations, the everyday joys and struggles of the average farmer, the craftsperson. Their voices are almost completely silent. And that leaves us with one last, really crucial question. We crack the code and unlock this magnificent history of kings and empires. But if that's the only story we can easily read, what other histories, what other voices are still out there, lost in time, just waiting to be heard?
So, what happens when the official rules of a society just don't match up with how people actually live their lives? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore as we journey back to ancient India between roughly 600 BCE and 600 CE. We're going to uncover the fascinating gap between the prescribed social norms and the messy, complex reality of it all. And our main guide on this journey? It's one of the world's longest and most incredible epic poems, the Mahabharata. Now, this story of a massive war between cousins is so much more than just a myth. For historians, it's like a treasure chest absolutely packed with clues about the kinship, the caste, and the class structures of an entire civilization.
So here's the plan. First, we'll peel back the layers of these ancient texts and see how historians actually get their secrets out. Then, we'll dive right into the core of society, family and caste, and expose the pretty surprising contrast between the official rules and how people really lived. And finally, we're going to put these stories to the ultimate test, comparing them to what's been literally written in stone.
Okay, so how in the world do you turn an epic poem, one filled with gods and heroes, into a reliable historical document? Well, it's all about critical analysis. It's about learning to read between the lines of the story.
First off, you've got to appreciate the sheer scale of our source here. The Mahabharata wasn't written by one person in one sitting. No way! This is a colossal work, put together over a millennium. That's 1,000 years, which means it captures all these evolving social attitudes and practices across centuries.
And this is where the real detective work comes in. Historians don't just take one text at face value. They compare the official Sanskrit versions, which were often written by and for the Brahmana elite, with other sources, things like texts written in common languages and, of course, physical archaeology, to see where the stories line up, and more importantly, where they don't.
All right, let's get to our first case study, the family. It's the fundamental building block of any society. So, what were the rules? And, who was breaking them? The official ideal was crystal clear: patrilineal. This means everything. Power, property, your whole family line. It all passed from father to son. In fact, the central conflict in the Mahabharata itself is a catastrophic war fought over this very principle.
And this idea ran deep. I mean, really deep. This quote right here is from a Rigvedic marriage mantra, which is over 1,000 years old. It just shows the immense cultural pressure on women to produce sons and keep that male line going.
But of course, ideals are one thing. And life? Well, life is usually something else entirely. Was society really this straightforward?
Not even close. In fact, we have evidence that points to a completely different system running right alongside it, matronymics, where your identity was actually traced through your mother.
Case in point, the Satavahanas. These were seriously powerful rulers in western and southern India.
and inscriptions show that their kings were identified by their mother's name. For instance, one of their most powerful rulers was called Gautami Putta, which literally means son of Gautami. And this wasn't some exception. This was the elite, openly going against that patrilineal ideal.
And it didn't stop there. The Brahmanical rulebook was super strict. A woman had to take her husband's clan name, or Gatra, and marrying inside your own clan was a huge no-no. Well, the Satavahanas did the exact opposite. Their queens kept their own father's Gatra, and sometimes they even married relatives. This was a direct defiance of the rules everyone was supposed to be following.
These questions about who you are and who you can marry lead us straight to an even more rigid system, caste, or Varna. And just like with family, the gap between the official rules and what people actually did was absolutely massive.
So, the ideal, as it was laid down in religious texts called the Dharma Sutras, was this four-part hierarchy. You had the Brahmanas, the priests, at the very top. Then the Kshatriyas, the warriors and kings. After them came the Vaishyas, who were the farmers and merchants, and then right at the bottom, the Shudras, who were meant to serve the other three.
Now, this social order wasn't just a suggestion. It was presented as being divinely created, literally emerging from the body of a primeval cosmic man. This myth was an incredibly powerful tool to justify a system where your status was locked in from birth.
The texts were clear. Only Kshatriyas could be kings. Simple, right? But what history shows us is that this rule was, well, ignored a lot. In fact, some of the most powerful dynasties, like the Mauryas, were actually described in Brahmanical texts as being of low origin. What this tells us is that political power was often up for grabs for anyone who could get the support and the resources. You had rulers like the Shakas, who came from Central Asia and were labeled as barbarians by the elite, yet they became powerful kings who were totally familiar with Sanskritic traditions. Power, it seems, could definitely trump religious rules.
But what happened when someone from the very bottom of the ladder tried to cross those boundaries? The Mahabharata gives us this really chilling story about Ekalavya, a young man from a forest-dwelling community who dreamed of becoming the world's greatest archer. He went to the great teacher Drona, who taught all the royal princes, but Drona shot him down, basically because he wasn't a kshatriya. But Ekalavya didn't give up. He made a clay statue of Drona and just taught himself, eventually becoming even better than all of Drona's noble students.
But when Drona found out about this, he saw it as a threat to the whole social order. So to make sure his favorite student Arjuna would stay the best, he demanded a horrific price for his supposed teaching, Ekalavya's right thumb. And just like that, without his thumb, Ekalavya's dream was over. It's a brutal story about how the rules were enforced.
So finally, let's see what happens when we check these epic stories against the hard evidence. What do archaeologists actually find when they dig up the places mentioned in the Mahabharata?
The epic describes the capital city, Hastinapura, as this magnificent, sprawling metropolis. But when the archaeologist B.B. Lal excavated the site back in the 1950s, he found something, well, a little more modest. Simple structures, mud brick, walls of reeds plastered with mud, a huge gap between the poetic fantasy and the archaeological facts. And this reveals the true nature of the Mahabharata. It's not a static photograph of one moment in time. It's a dynamic text, a living conversation that unfolded over centuries. The contradictions and the gaps aren't mistakes. They're the evidence of a society that was constantly negotiating, challenging, and redefining its own rules. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If the so-called rules of a society are constantly in flux, being bent, broken, and rewritten by the very people they're meant to control, what does that tell us about the nature of social structures, both back then and maybe even now? You know, some stories aren't found in books. They're literally carved in stone. And today we're going to decode one of the most incredible archaeological survivors on the entire planet, the Great Stupa at Sanchi. All right, let's get right into it. Wow, I mean, just look at this. This is the Eastern Gateway at Sanchi, and every single inch of it is just teeming with life, with incredible stories and so much meaning. We're talking about a masterpiece of art and architecture that's been standing for more than 2,000 years. It's just mind-boggling.
But that's got to make you wonder, right? In a place where so many ancient buildings have just turned to dust, how on earth did this one survive? What's its secret? Well, that's the big mystery we're diving into today. All right, so first up, let's get into the incredible story of how it survived. And trust me, it's a tale that's part brilliant planning and part
Well, sheer good luck.
Okay, to really get why Sanchi's survival is so special, you have to see the contrast. On one hand, you have Sanchi, still standing, but on the other, you have Amaravati. It was once one of the most magnificent stupas ever built, and now? It's basically just a little mound. All its incredible carved panels were just picked up and carried off to museums in Madras, Calcutta, and even London. What a tragic end.
So, the big question is, why did Sanchi make it? Well, a huge part of the answer comes down to the super smart rulers of Bhopal, specifically Shah Jahan Begum and her successor, Sultan Jahan Begum. Get this, when French and English officials came knocking, wanting to literally carry off the original gateways, the Begums had a genius idea. They said, how about we give you these perfect plaster cast copies instead? And it worked. That brilliant move, plus the money they put into preservation, is why we can still see it today.
Okay, so we know how it survived, but to understand why it was even built in the first place, we need to kind of zoom out. We have to look at the world it came from. And let me tell you, it was a time of absolutely incredible intellectual and spiritual energy.
Think about it. The middle of the first millennium BCE. It was a massive turning point for humanity. All over the globe, big thinkers were asking these huge, profound questions. You had Zarathustra over in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates in Greece. And right there in India, you had Mahavira and the Buddha. It was like a global philosophical explosion all at once.
And in India's Ganga Valley, people were debating everything. The old Vedic traditions of sacrifice, they were being challenged. People were starting to ask these massive questions like, what is the whole point of life? Is there anything after we die? Is our destiny really shaped by our actions? These weren't just small talks. These debates completely set the stage for a brand new way of thinking.
And out of all this questioning came one of the most powerful new answers. And it came from a man named Siddhartha Gautama, the man we now know as the Buddha.
So the story goes that Siddhartha was this prince, completely sheltered from all the bad stuff in the world. But then, on his first trip outside the palace walls, bam, reality hits. He sees an old man, a sick man, and a dead body. And it just clicks for him that sickness, old age, and death are unavoidable. That one single encounter was so traumatic that it set him on a totally new path to find the truth, and he left his entire life of luxury behind.
So after years and years of searching, he finally achieved enlightenment. And the core of his teaching, the real takeaway, is this. He said that sorrow, the word for it is dukkha, is just a basic, fundamental part of being human. But, and this is the key part, he said there's a way out. That path to freedom is called nibbana. It's about extinguishing your ego, your desires, and that's how you break the cycle of suffering.
Okay, so you have these huge, profound ideas, but how in the world do you take all of that and turn it into a physical building? How do you give a belief a shape?
Well, the answer was the stupa. Now, the word itself just means heap in Sanskrit, and that's kind of what they were. These big mounds built over sacred relics of the Buddha. Things like his bodily remains or objects he might have used. The whole thing, the entire structure, became a sacred symbol of the Buddha himself and his journey to liberation.
And the building itself is just packed with symbolism. That big dome, the semicircular mound, is called the Anda. Then, on top of that, you've got the Harmika, which is this balcony-like thing that stands for the home of the gods. And then, rising out of that, you have a mast, usually with an umbrella on top. The whole design is basically a map of the cosmos, but built out of stone.
So who actually built this thing? Well, that's what's so cool about it. We know from inscriptions that it wasn't just some rich king who funded the whole project. No way. Donations poured in from everyone. We're talking royalty, sure, but also guilds of ivory carvers, and literally hundreds of regular people, men, women, monks, and nuns. Everybody chipped in to create this massive collective project of faith.
All right, now for my favorite part. Let's zoom in on those incredible gateways. Because this is where the story of Sanchi just explodes into life, in all the amazing carvings that cover basically every single surface.
So the artists who carved these had a really interesting puzzle to solve. The Buddha had reached nibbana, right? Which is a state that's beyond human form. So how do you carve a picture of someone who can't really be pictured? Their solution was absolutely genius. They used symbols. For example, look at this empty seat under the tree. Now, you might think it means he's not there, but it's the exact opposite. It's meant to show his presence. This represents the moment he became enlightened while meditating under the Bodhi tree. It's such a powerful way to show this huge event without actually showing the man himself.
Or, how about this? The wheel. This is the Dhammachakra, the wheel of Dharma. It stands for the Buddha's very first sermon, where he basically set the wheel of his teachings into motion, a single moment that would, change the world. And then, get this, the stupa itself is a symbol. In this carving, you can see people worshiping a stupa, and that represents the Buddha's final passing away, his Mahaparinibbana. So the monument is the ultimate symbol of his ultimate freedom.
But what's really fascinating is that it wasn't all strictly Buddhist ideas. Take a look at this incredible figure, the Shalabanjika. She was a kind of nature spirit from popular folklore. People believed that if she touched a tree, it would burst into flower. The fact that she's here shows how Buddhism didn't just replace old beliefs, it welcomed them in, weaving them into this rich, beautiful tapestry of the entire culture.
So, let's bring it all together. What does all of this mean for us today? What's the real legacy of a place like Sanchi?
When you look at it, Sanchi is so much more than just an old building. It's really a library of philosophy, a world-class art gallery, and an incredible monument to what a community can build when they share a powerful belief. It's like the spirit of an entire civilization was captured and preserved for all of us, right here in stone. And that really leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? If these stones can tell such a rich, complex story about our search for meaning, it makes you wonder, what other histories are out there waiting to be discovered, hidden in plain sight in the art, the buildings, and the symbols that we walk past every single day?
Have you ever stopped to think about what your own country, your own city, looks like to someone seeing it for the very first time? An outsider. They notice things we just walk past every day. Well, today we're going to do just that. We're going to see medieval India through the eyes of 3 completely different travelers to figure out what they saw and, maybe more importantly, why they saw it the way they did.
So, from the 10th all the way to the 17th century, you have this flow of visitors coming into the Indian subcontinent. And because their worlds were so different from what they were seeing, they zeroed in on the little things, the everyday routines and customs that local writers probably thought were too boring or obvious to even mention. And because of that, their accounts give us this incredible and often really surprising window into the past.
And that, right there, is the big question for us. These accounts aren't just a list of facts. Not at all. Every single traveler brought their own baggage with them, right? Their own reasons for being there, their own cultural blind spots, their own biases. They weren't just describing India, they were interpreting it. Sometimes they were trying to understand it, sometimes they were just in awe of it, and sometimes they were judging it.
To really unpack all of this, we're going to follow the journeys of 3 pretty remarkable guys. They're separated by hundreds of years, and each one left us with a vivid but totally different picture of India. So let's meet our guides.
First up, we're hitting way back to the 11th century to meet al-Biruni. Now, this guy wasn't your typical adventurer looking for thrills or a merchant trying to make a fortune. No, he was a scholar through and through, driven by this deep, powerful curiosity to genuinely understand a foreign culture from the inside. Al-Biruni's story is just wild. He was actually brought to modern-day Afghanistan as a hostage. But instead of just waiting around, he used his time to master Sanskrit, which is no easy task. He spent years with Brahmana priests and scholars, just diving headfirst into their religious texts, their philosophy. He really wanted to get India on its own terms, not just be an outsider looking in. What's so amazing about al-Biruni is how methodical he was. Before he even starts describing the society, he lays out all the challenges he's facing. He straight up says that the language barrier, the completely different religious beliefs, and what he saw as a kind of local self-absorption were huge hurdles. That kind of intellectual honesty is exactly what makes his work so incredibly valuable. So, when he tried to explain something as complex as the caste system, he went straight to the source, the Sanskrit texts he'd been studying so hard. He laid out the Brahminical view of creation, explaining how each social group was believed to have come from a different part of a cosmic being, Brahma. He was trying to present the system exactly as its followers understood it. But here's the thing, al-Biruni wasn't just a copy machine. He was a critical thinker. He argued that the whole idea of ritual impurity, which was so central to the caste system, just didn't make sense to him. He looked at the world around him and saw that nature cleans itself. The sun cleans the air, salt in the ocean purifies the water. So he concluded that this idea of social pollution had to be, in his words, contrary to the laws of nature. Okay, let's jump forward to the 14th century, where we meet a completely different character, Ibn Battuta from Morocco. For this guy, the world wasn't something you study in a book.
It was something you had to go out and experience. He was the ultimate globetrotter. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? He was only 22 when he left home, driven by this unstoppable urge to see the world. And get this, his journey lasted for nearly 30 years. His book, The Rihla, isn't a dry academic text. It's a personal, action-packed story, filled with the sheer excitement of discovering new places and new people.
And this just perfectly shows his whole approach. He wanted to make the strange and unfamiliar relatable. He knew the folks back home in Morocco had no clue what a coconut was, so he compared it to a human head, with 2 eyes and a mouth. It's such a simple but brilliant way to paint a picture with words and share that feeling of wonder. Unlike our quiet scholar Al-Biruni, Ibn Battuta dove right into the chaos. He found India's cities to be these incredible, thriving centers of life. He described Delhi as this massive, jam-packed city, just overflowing with goods and opportunities for anyone with talent and a bit of hustle.
He was also just blown away by the infrastructure. I mean, look at this breakdown of their postal system. It was this super sophisticated network of horse and foot runners. He just marveled at the fact that it was so efficient it could get intelligence to the Sultan in just 5 days, a journey that would normally take 50. They could even use it to ship luxury goods like fresh fruit over huge distances. Incredible.
All right, let's fast forward again, another 3 centuries to the 1600s. Our last guide, François Bernier, a French doctor, shows up in Mughal India. And he's not here to just learn or to experience. He's here to compare, to contrast, and let's be honest, to criticize. You see, Bernier's whole point of view was shaped by his goal. He was writing for an audience back home in France, which included the king. His accounts were basically meant to be a cautionary tale, using what he saw as India's problems to show how much better European systems supposedly were and to influence politics back home.
For Bernier, everything, and I mean everything, wrong with India came down to one single issue: private property. Or rather, the lack of it. He argued that because the Mughal emperor owned all the land, nobody had any reason to invest in it or improve it. And in his mind, that led directly to ruined farms and a society that had only super-rich nobles and desperately poor peasants. He painted a really grim picture. In his version of India, there's no middle class at all, just a suffering population being crushed by a greedy ruling elite. He actually called the king a ruler of beggars and barbarians, and said the countryside was just barren and neglected.
But, and this is a huge but, there's a massive contradiction buried right in his own writings. He's saying the country is ruined, but at the same time, he's describing India as a global economic engine that exports so many beautiful goods that it's sucking in tons of the world's gold and silver. So, how could a nation of beggars be producing so much wealth? So what are we left with? We've got the careful scholar, the wide-eyed adventurer, and the harsh critic. 3 men looking at the same part of the world who came back with 3 completely different stories. So, who was telling the truth?
Well, the real answer is they all were, at least from their own point of view. As you can see here, their motive really shaped their method, and that in turn shaped their big takeaway. Al-Biruni wanted to understand, so he studied texts. Ibn Battuta wanted to experience, so he traveled. And Bernier wanted to make a political point, so he compared everything to Europe.
For us today, their real value isn't in picking one and saying he was right. It's in layering their stories together. The contradictions and the biases are just as revealing as the straight-up observations. When we understand why they saw things the way they did, we get a much deeper, more complex picture of the past. And these ideas had consequences. Bernier's ideas about a degenerate East, for example, became incredibly influential in Europe for centuries.
And all of this leaves us with one final thought. These 3 men gave us an invaluable gift, but they were all educated, elite, foreign men. Their stories aren't the stories of the farmers, the craftspeople, or the millions of women whose lives they barely even saw. It's a powerful reminder that history is never the full picture. It's always shaped by who gets to tell the story.
You know, for 1,000 years, something incredible was happening across the Indian subcontinent. It was a revolution, but not one of swords or armies. This was a revolution of the heart. It was this massive shift away from all the rigid, formal stuff, the rituals, and towards something way more personal, an intense, emotional, and direct connection to the divine.
So in this explainer, we're going to dive right into that story. We're talking about 2 amazing movements that were happening at the same time, often weaving together. You've got the Bhakti tradition in Hinduism, and then you have the mystical Sufi path in Islam.
And let me tell you, together, they completely rewove the fabric of faith for millions and millions of people.
Okay, so how did this whole new spiritual world even come about? Well, it wasn't about just throwing out all the old beliefs. Not at all. It was more like a conversation. You had these ancient formal traditions, right? And they started mixing with these new, really passionate ways of expressing faith that were just bubbling up from everyday people.
A good way to picture this is to think of two currents in a river. You've got what sociologists call the Great Tradition. That's the big, official, elite stuff, usually based in Sanskrit. And then you have the little traditions, all the amazing, diverse local beliefs of ordinary folks. And really, this whole era is defined by how those two currents flowed into each other. And here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Meet Jagannatha. Now, he started out as a local wooden deity, worshipped by tribal communities in what's now Odisha. But over time, he becomes identified as a form of Vishnu, one of the biggest gods in the Hindu pantheon. See? It's a classic case of a little tradition getting woven right into the great one. So cool.
Okay, so you've got this mixing happening. But then, things get supercharged, and it's all thanks to a new kind of spiritual leader, the poet saints of the Bhakti movement. These folks didn't challenge the old ways with complicated books. No, they did it with songs. Simple, beautiful songs of pure love for God, sung in the languages everyone actually spoke.
Some of the very first and most powerful of these movements kicked off down in Tamil Nadu. They were led by two main groups, the Alvars, who were just completely immersed, as they said, in their love for the god Vishnu. And then you had the Nayanars, who were just as passionate about Shiva. And what did they do? They traveled all over, from temple to temple, singing these incredible, ecstatic hymns. I mean, people still sing them today.
Now, this is so important to get. This wasn't just a spiritual thing. Oh no, it was a full-blown social revolution. These saints were openly pushing back against the super rigid caste system. They were challenging the power of the Brahmanas. And their communities, they welcomed everybody. We're talking artisans, farmers, even people who society had labeled untouchable. And, maybe the most radical part of all, they made space for women and lifted up their voices. And you see this so clearly with women like Karakal Amayer. I mean, she just shattered the expectations for women at the time. She basically said no thanks to all her social duties, being a wife, running a household, and chose this incredibly intense path of devotion to Shiva instead. Just look at this statue. You can feel her power, can't you?
And just listen to her poetry. She calls herself a female demoness. She's deliberately throwing away every single conventional idea of what a woman should look like. Instead, she embraces this kind of scary, starved look as proof of her total, all-in love for Shiva. Wow, what a powerful statement to make.
And this revolutionary fire just kept spreading. If you go a bit further north, into Karnataka, you find a reformer named Basavana. He led a movement called the Virashaivas, and they took things even further. They weren't just challenging the system, they were questioning its very foundations. The whole idea of caste, these rules about who's pure or polluted, and even the concept of rebirth itself.
Okay, so while all of this is going on, something else is happening. Another deep, mystical path is starting to grow roots in the subcontinent. As Islam arrived, this incredibly personal, mystical side of it, known as Sufism, found a really welcoming and vibrant new home in India.
So how did Sufism work? Well, it was all built around this deep, personal relationship. It all starts with a master, a teacher, called a sheikh. His students and followers would all hang out in a community center called a khanqa. Think of it as a place for prayer, learning, and helping people out. This creates a kind of spiritual chain, or a silsila. And then, when that master passed away, his tomb, or dargah, becomes a super important, sacred place where people would come to visit for centuries.
Now, out of all the different Sufi groups, one in particular just became huge in India, the Chishtis. And you want to know their secret? They were amazing at adapting. They didn't try to shut out the local culture. Instead, they absorbed and embraced parts of the devotional traditions that were already there.
And this, right here, is where the story gets really cool. Because these two powerful spiritual rivers, Bhakti and Sufism, they don't just flow next to each other. No, they start to mix. They start to look like each other, to speak this common language of pure divine love.
I mean, just take a look here. On one side, you've got the Hindu god Krishna, charming the entire world with his flute. And on the other, you've got a Sufi gathering, a sama, where they're using music to reach this state of pure spiritual joy. It's amazing, right? Both traditions figured out that music and poetry, well, they weren't just for fun. They were a highway straight to the divine.
The similarities are just mind-blowing when you lay them out. The Bhakti tradition, it has its guru. Sufism, it has its pir or sheikh. Both of them use music in their worship. And both were really digging into the nature of God. Like, does God have a form, saguna, or is God formless, nirguna? They even shared this idea of just remembering God, like the Sufi practice of zikr, repeating God's name over and over. It was seen as a key to everything.
And if you want one person who just embodies this incredible meeting of minds, it's gotta be the poet Saint Kabir. He was totally fearless. He pulled from Hindu traditions, from Muslim traditions, and he just brushed aside all the religious labels. For him, like he says so beautifully here, it didn't matter if you called God Allah or Ram or Kareem. They were all just words, just names for the same single ultimate truth.
Right, but it's important to remember none of this was happening in a bubble. Because these movements became so incredibly popular, they suddenly had a lot of social and political clout. And this led to a really interesting kind of complex stance with the kings and sultans who were in charge.
See, the rulers, they weren't dumb. They saw how much the people loved these saints, and they realized, hey, we can use this. So kings, sultans, emperors, you name it, they all wanted to get the blessings of these holy figures. You see it way back with the Chola kings in the 9th century, building huge temples for Shiva inspired by the Nayanars. And you see it centuries later with the Mughal Emperor Akbar, going on pilgrimages to Sufi shrines. Why? It was a way to make their own rules seem more legit, more blessed.
And all of this royal support left us with some absolutely breathtaking architecture. Just look at this. This is the tomb of the Sufi master Sheikh Salim Chishti. It was built by Emperor Akbar, who was incredibly grateful to him. It's just a gorgeous physical reminder of the powerful connection that could form between the rulers and the saints.
So after all that, what do we take away from this 1,000-year revolution of the heart? Well, I think the legacy of the Bhakti and Sufi saints leaves us with this huge, timeless question. What does it really mean to have faith? Is it all about the external stuff, the rituals? Or is it about building a deep, personal, and loving relationship with whatever you hold to be divine? It's the question they were asking 1,000 years ago, and you know what? It's a question that's just as relevant for us right now.
All right, today we're going to journey back in time to the incredible ruins of a lost empire. This place is Vijayanagara, which literally means the city of victory. And for a long time, it really was. It was an absolute powerhouse in southern India that rose, shined incredibly brightly, and then, well, it just sort of vanished. Just look at this. It looks like a chariot, right? But it's actually a temple, carved entirely from stone. This single amazing structure kind of tells the whole story. It's an absolute masterpiece of art and engineering, but it's sitting in the middle of a deserted, ruined city. It's beautiful and haunting all at once. So that brings up the big questions, doesn't it? Who on earth built all this? And maybe more importantly, how did a city this advanced and powerful end up as a ruin? Well, those are the questions we're going to tackle. Let's dig in and piece together the story of Vijayanagara from its incredible start to its tragic finish. So first things first, how did this empire even come to be? Its rise was incredibly fast and unbelievably impactful. It basically changed the entire map of southern India forever. Well, the story goes that two brothers, Harihara and Buka, kicked the whole thing off way back in 1336. And that name they chose, Vijayanagara, that's a real statement, you know? The city of victory. Talk about ambitious. And for more than 200 years, they absolutely lived up to that name, becoming the dominant force in the region. Now, over its long history, the empire was actually ruled by 4 different dynasties. The founders, the Sangamas, got it started. But the empire's absolute peak, its golden age, that happened under the Tuluva dynasty. And that dynasty gave us its most famous king ever. And that king was Krishna-Deva-Raya. This quote right here basically gives away the secret to the empire's success. He knew that real power wasn't just about having a big army. It was about fueling it with a booming economy built on trade with the entire world. So what was their playbook? It was brilliant, really. They controlled the best farmland, which is always a good start. Then they dominated overseas trade, exporting things everyone wanted, like spices and textiles. But here's the key. They used that wealth to import the best military gear of the day. We're talking powerful war horses from Arabia and even cutting-edge firearms from the Portuguese. Okay, so now let's step inside the city itself, because the ruins that we can see today, they reveal a city that was unbelievably sophisticated, a true work of strategic genius designed for both grandeur and survival. One of the most amazing things about this place is how they handled water. I mean, it's located in one of the driest parts of the whole peninsula. So how did they do it? They became masters of hydraulic engineering, building this incredible network of tanks, canals, and aqueducts, just like this one, to pipe water right into the city's heart. Now, when you have a city that wealthy, you've got to protect it. And boy, did they. Foreign visitors, like a Persian ambassador named Abdurazak, were just stunned. Their minds were blown by the fortifications. These were not just simple walls. This was defense on a whole other level. He described a city protected by 7, yeah, you heard that right, 7 concentric lines of fortification. Can you imagine trying to attack that? 7 rings of massive stone walls. What a nightmare for any invading army. And this is where their strategy was just brilliant. See, most cities just put walls around the buildings. Not them. They made their walls so big that they enclosed huge areas of farmland and forests inside the fortifications. The goal was to make the city a self-sufficient fortress. An enemy could surround them for years, and they could just keep growing their own food inside. Genius. All right, let's zoom in on the royal center, the political and ceremonial heart of the entire empire. This was the command center. This was where the power and the wealth of Vijayanagara were put on full display for the world to see. This massive platform is called the Mahanavami Dibba, and you can think of it as a giant stage for the king to show off. During a huge 9-day festival, he'd host these incredible spectacles. Just imagine, processions of elephants covered in gold, wrestling matches, ceremonies, all of it designed to wow his friends and intimidate his enemies. And the architecture here is just fascinating. You'll see these really elegant buildings like the Lotus Mahal, and then right nearby, gateways with arches and domes. That style shows a clear influence from the Islamic sultanates to the north. They weren't afraid to borrow and blend styles, creating this unique fusion that was totally their own. So that's the royalty, but what about the regular folks? Well, their houses were made of thatch, so they haven't survived. But we have these eyewitness accounts, like this one from a Portuguese traveler, Duarte Barbosa. He gives us a peek into a really well-organized city, with long streets arranged by what people did for a living, a buzzing hub of everyday life. Now, let's shift over to the northern part of the city. This area is known as the Sacred Center. It's the oldest part of the settlement, and it's really the spiritual soul of the empire, a place completely wrapped up in myth and religion. So why did they build their capital right here? It wasn't random. Local traditions actually link these rocky hills to the epic story of the Ramayana. They believed this was the mythical kingdom of the monkeys. So this landscape was already sacred, long before the city even existed. The spiritual anchor for the entire kingdom was the Virupaksha temple. And this part is crucial. The Vijayanagara kings claimed they didn't rule in their own right. Instead, they said they were ruling on behalf of the god Virupaksha. Every royal order was even signed in his name. It was a powerful way to legitimize their rule, blending politics and religion together perfectly. And they used architecture to shout about their power. They built these gigantic gateways to the temples called gopurams. And get this, the gateways were often way, way taller than the actual temple shrine inside. They were like enormous billboards that you could see for miles, signaling that a very powerful, very devout king was in charge. For 200 years, the city of Victory seemed invincible, but its end came so suddenly and so violently. It was a total, tragic collapse that left a massive hole in the history of southern India. So what happened? After Krishnadeva Raya died, things got shaky. Then in 1565, it all came to a head. A coalition of rival sultanates defeated the Vijayanagara army in a massive battle. The winners then sacked the capital so thoroughly it was just abandoned. For centuries, it was a ghost city, a local legend, until 1800, when an officer from the East India Company named Colin Mackenzie finally brought its story back to life. When we look back at this history, we have the official story, which we see in things like the statue of Krishnadeva Raya. This is how he wanted to be remembered. Pious, powerful, a perfect ruler. This is the history that's literally set in stone.
But then you get an eyewitness account from a traveler like Domingo Paez, and he describes the same king as, well, a person. Of medium height, rather fat than thin, he has on his face signs of smallpox. And that contrast leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? What's the truer history? The idealized image that powerful people create for themselves, or the simple human details that an observer happens to write down? The ruins of Vijayanagara remind us that history is never just one simple story. It's a complex tapestry woven from both myth and reality. And that's a lesson that is just as relevant today as it was centuries ago.
When you picture the Mughal Empire, what comes to mind? Probably grand emperors, magnificent forts, epic battles, right? But what if I told you the real engine of this mighty empire, its true backbone, was actually something way more humble, the village? And to really get it, we need to start with one single powerful number. 85%. That's not just a statistic, it's the key to unlocking the entire Mughal world. This number is staggering and represents the proportion of the population that didn't live in the grand cities, but out in the countryside.
And this simple fact, well, it changes everything. It means that the entire magnificent structure, the courts, the conquests, the art, the culture, all of it was financed almost entirely by the agricultural wealth produced by millions upon millions of peasants, living in villages that looked a lot like this.
So, to truly understand the empire, we have to zoom in. We're going to leave the grand capitals behind and travel to the basic unit of Mughal society, a single village.
This painting gives us a glimpse into a world that is just teeming with life. This isn't just a quiet collection of huts. It's a complex, self-contained society. Let's use this image as our portal, a way to understand all the key players who made this world turn.
At the very heart of it all, of course, were the peasants. They were the ones doing the endless, back-breaking tasks of tilling, sowing, and harvesting. And notice the detail here. This wasn't primitive farming. They're using some pretty sophisticated technology, like the Persian wheel you see here, to irrigate their fields and get the most out of their land. Now, it's easy to think of peasants as just one big group, right? But the sources from the time show it was more complex. You had two main types, the Khud Kashta, who were residents farming their own land in their home village, and then you had the Pahi Kashta, who were non-resident cultivators. These were folks who might move to a different village for better tax rates, or maybe they were forced to relocate after a famine. This shows a society with a surprising amount of movement, totally challenging that old idea of a static, unchanging village.
So who was actually in charge of all this? Well, day-to-day life wasn't run by some distant official in a far-off city. It was handled by the Panchayat, an assembly of the village elders. This group was the absolute center of local justice, social order, and community life.
And they had real authority, let me tell you. Led by a headman, or a muqaddam, the panchayat basically ran the whole show. They supervised the village finances, they made sure social norms and caste rules were followed, they settled arguments between villagers, and they even organized funding for big community projects like digging a canal or getting through a flood.
And we absolutely have to talk about the vital economic role of women. They worked shoulder to shoulder with men out in the fields, but they also dominated crucial artisanal production, like spinning yarn for textiles. They were totally indispensable contributors to both the household and the wider village economy.
Okay, so we've met the people, but what exactly was all this labor producing? If you're picturing just simple subsistence farming, growing just enough to get by, think again. The reality was way more diverse and deeply commercial.
This detail from the great historical chronicle, the Aini Akbari, is just incredible. I mean, think about that for a second. 43 different varieties of crops grown just around Delhi, 50 different kinds of rice in Bengal alone. This was not simple farming. This was an immensely productive agricultural engine.
And this slide, this shows just how connected the Mughal village was to the wider world. Brand new crops from the Americas were arriving and completely transforming local diets and economies. Maize, tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, all of them became staples. And tobacco? The fact that it spread so rapidly shows that even a remote peasant was now part of a new, global exchange of goods.
Of course, the state was tracking all of this meticulously. To figure out taxes fairly, they developed this really sophisticated system of land classification. Land was categorized based on how productive it was, from polage, which was top-tier land cultivated every single year, down to banjar, which was left fallow for 5 years or more. This was basically a data-driven approach to collecting revenue.
So this is where it gets really crucial, understanding the relationships between these groups. You've got the peasants doing all the work, and you've got the state collecting the revenue. But in between them stood a very, very powerful class of intermediaries.
These were the zamindars. Think of them as the powerful landed gentry at the very top of rural society. They weren't just landlords, they had the state's authority to collect taxes, and they backed up that authority with their own small armies. They were absolutely essential intermediaries, but they were also a constant competing power that the state always had to manage. And this is a huge but, the peasants were not powerless. When they felt like they were being exploited by an official or a zamindar, they used the system. The archives are filled with petitions to the panchayats demanding justice. This shows us they had a very clear idea of their rights, and they believed in a kind of moral contract, an expectation that their rulers had obligations they were supposed to fulfill.
All right, for our final piece of the puzzle, let's zoom all the way out. That village we started in, it wasn't just connected to the capital city. It was connected to the entire world, all through the flow of one precious metal.
This quote from a European traveler at the time just says it all. Silver, mined in unbelievable quantities in places like Potosi in South America, was flooding the global economy. And India, with its desirable goods like textiles and spices, acted like a giant sponge, becoming the final destination for so much of that wealth.
And here's the direct impact of that global flow. All this silver allowed the Mughal state to create a stable, standardized currency, the silver rupiah. This was a total game changer. It meant the state could now demand that taxes be paid in cash, not just in grain. All of a sudden, the wheat grown in a remote village was directly linked through this coin to the silver mines of the New World.
So what we have is this incredibly dynamic, commercialized, and globally connected world. It's a complex web of peasants, powerful zamindars, and a methodical state, all fueled by grain from the fields and silver from across the oceans. But this intricate system would soon be confronted by a rising new force from Europe. And the great question is, how would it cope?
You know, when we think about British colonial rule in India, it's easy to just picture soldiers and flags. But the real story, the one that affected millions of people, was what happened in the countryside. We're going to dive into how new laws, new crops, and even wars happening on the other side of the world could completely remake a nation, sparking rebellions and changing lives forever.
Okay, so how did it all go down? Well, our story really kicks off with the English East India Company. Now, these guys started out as just traders, right? But to really lock down their profits, they realized they had to control the land. And their first big experiment in trying to re-engineer an entire rural society, that happened in Bengal.
So the company had a problem. It needed cash, a steady, reliable, predictable flow of it. Their solution was, well, it was pretty radical. They introduced a brand new policy designed to fix their income from the land, but in the process, they ended up completely redrawing the lines of power that had existed for centuries. And this is the man they sent to do it, Charles Cornwallis. Now, you might recognize that name. He's the very same British general who surrendered to the Americans at Yorktown. So he comes over to India to roll out this new system called the permanent settlement. The goal sounded simple enough: create order and get a reliable tax base. The reality, though, it was absolute chaos.
So here's the deal with this permanent settlement. The company basically said, okay, this is the amount of tax we're taking from this land, and it's fixed, forever. To collect it, they took the traditional local bigwigs, the Rajas and Talukdars, and gave them a new job title, Zemindars. Their only job was to collect the tax and hand it over. The British hoped this would create a new class of loyal landowners who'd invest in their farms. But oh man, it got messy fast.
So, did it create a stable, loyal class of landlords? Not even close. In fact, the permanent settlement basically pushed the traditional zamindars right to the edge of a cliff. They were trapped in this brand new, unforgiving system that they just couldn't figure out how to survive in. And the impact, I mean, the numbers here are just mind-blowing. Within just a few years of this new system, a whopping 75% of all the zamindaris in Bengal had been sold off at auction. Think about that. 3/4 of the traditional landed elite just lost everything. So what on earth went so wrong? Well, it was basically a perfect storm of problems. First off, the initial tax they set was just ridiculously high. Then they brought in this brutal sunset law. If you didn't pay up by sunset on the due date, that's it. Your land was auctioned off. No excuses. And the final kick? The company took away all their local muscle. They couldn't even run their own police anymore, which made it almost impossible to actually collect the rent from their tenants. But you can't count these guys out. They were clever. They figured out ways to fight back, using these, let's call them creative legal strategies. The most famous was the fictitious sale. A zamindar would just not pay his taxes on purpose, let his estate go to auction, have his own people buy it, and then they'd refuse to pay. They'd repeat this again and again until the government and all the other bidders just gave up, and the zamindar could buy his own land back for peanuts. Now, while the old guard, the zamindars, were scrambling to survive, a whole new power player was rising up from inside the villages themselves, the jokadars. These guys were wealthy peasants, the big fish in the small pond. They lived right there, controlled local trade, acted as moneylenders, and had a ton of power over the poorer farmers. And guess who was buying up all those auctioned estates? Yep, the jokadars. Okay, so let's shift gears. We're leaving the flat plains of Bengal and heading for the rugged, forested Rajmahal Hills, because here we see a totally different kind of conflict, a direct clash between two completely different cultures and their ways of life. And you can boil this conflict down to two simple tools, the hoe versus the plow. On one side, you have the Biharias, the original people of these hills. They lived with the forest, practicing a kind of shifting cultivation with a simple hoe. On the other side, you have the Santals. Now, the British loved these guys. They saw them as ideal settlers who would come in, clear the forest, and farm the land with a proper plow. And it's so interesting how the British saw this landscape. They were completely torn. Their artists would either paint it as this beautiful, romantic, untouched paradise, or they'd see it as a dark, dangerous, wild place that had to be conquered and tamed. There was really no in-between for them. So, to tame this wilderness, the British did what they did best. They drew a line on a map. They carved out this huge territory called the Damin-e-Kol, which basically means the skirt of the hills, and they officially gave it to the Santals. The plan was pretty simple. Get them to settle down and farm, which would mean more tax money, and it would also push the less cooperative Paharias further and further back into the mountains. And you know what? At first, it seemed to work like a charm. Santhal settlements just exploded. But pretty soon, the Santhals realized their dream had turned into a nightmare. They were getting crushed by state taxes, exploited by moneylenders, and squeezed by zamindars. Their promised land had become a trap. And in 1855, they'd had enough, and they rose up in a massive, violent rebellion. It's fascinating to see the before and after in British art from this period. Before the revolt, you see these calm, almost romantic pictures of Santhal life. They're the perfect, hardworking, peaceful subjects. And then, bam, the rebellion hits, and that peaceful image is just shattered. Suddenly, they're not ideal settlers anymore. They're depicted as these fierce rebels fighting back against the colonial state. The whole narrative just flips overnight. And the British response? It was exactly what you'd expect. Overwhelming, swift, and absolutely brutal. They brought in the army, crushed the rebellion, and made a very public, very violent example of anyone who resisted. All right, for our final story, we're heading west to the Bombay Deccan. And this one is fascinating because it shows just how connected the world was becoming. We're going to see how a war fought thousands of miles away, the American Civil War, would light a fuse that led to yet another massive peasant revolt in India. So how does that work? Well, think about it. Before 1861, Britain's gigantic textile industry ran almost entirely on cotton from the American South. The Civil War starts, and suddenly, that supply chain is completely choked off. American cotton imports dropped to less than 3% of what they were. For British industry, this was a full-blown crisis. Desperate for a new supplier, Britain turned its eyes to India. And just look at what happened to the price of Indian cotton. It just went to the moon, more than tripling in just 4 years. This kicked off an absolutely insane speculative cotton boom in the Deccan region. Yeah, this quote really says it all. All of a sudden, money was flowing like water. Moneylenders, the Sahukars, were practically throwing cash at peasants, telling them, plant cotton, plant more cotton. Here's a huge loan to get you started. For a little while, it must have felt like a gold rush. And you can just feel the frantic energy here. A whole economy just popped up to get this white gold from the fields to the ports and then all the way to the mills in England. It was a total whirlwind, a mad dash to cash in on the boom. But like all booms built on shaky ground, this one was about to go bust. In 1865, the American Civil War ended. American cotton came flooding back onto the market, and the price for Indian cotton just collapsed. The party was over, and the Deccan peasants were left with fields of worthless crops and just mountains of debt. 10 years later, that desperation finally boiled over into the Deccan riots. And what's so telling is what they went after. The peasants marched on the moneylenders, but not to harm them. No, they went for the paperwork. They wanted the account books, the debt bonds, the physical proof of their impossible debts, and they burned them in huge bonfires. They weren't just attacking a person, they were attacking the entire system. So when you step back and look at all these stories, the landlords in Bengal, the forest dwellers in the Rajmahal Hills, the cotton farmers in the Deccan, you see this clear pattern, right? British rule wasn't just a change in government. It was a massive, disruptive earthquake that shook the very foundations of rural life. Old worlds, like the one symbolized by this decaying palace, were just swept away, replaced by new systems that created wealth for some, but also created entirely new kinds of struggle for millions. And it all leaves you with this big question, one that's just as relevant today as it was then. When huge new economic systems are forced onto a place, who actually gets to decide what progress looks like? And more importantly, who always ends up paying the price? Today, we're diving into a single explosive year that completely changed the history of India forever. 1857. And let me tell you, this was way more than just a rebellion. It was a firestorm that came incredibly close to burning down the most powerful empire on the planet. I want you to try and imagine this for a second. You're a British officer in 1857. You feel invincible, right? You're part of a global superpower. Then, almost overnight, it all just starts to crumble. I mean, this quote from a British officer at the time, it just says it all. In the summer of 1857, British rule in India, something that seems so permanent, was brought right to its knees. So the big question is, how? How on earth did a mutiny by a handful of soldiers spiral into a war that could have actually taken down the entire British Empire? That's what we're going to unpack. This wasn't some small skirmish. It was a fire that nearly burned the whole British Raj to the ground. So, what led the match? Well, our story kicks off not in a palace or a parliament, but with a sudden, violent explosion in a military town. Okay, so it's the afternoon of May 10th, 1857. The city of Meerut, you can just feel the tension in the air. And then, it happens. The cantonment just erupts. Indian soldiers, they were called sepoys, turn their guns on their own British officers. They storm the armory, they grab weapons, and they just start attacking any symbol of British power they can find. By the time night falls, the city is theirs. But here's the thing. This wasn't just random chaos. In the middle of all that smoke and fury, a group of sepoys knew exactly what they were doing. They got on their horses and rode through the night. Their destination? Delhi, the ancient capital of the Mughal Empire. They weren't just looking for a place to hide. They were looking for a leader, a symbol that could unite everyone. So they show up at the incredible Red Fort, once the heart of Mughal power, only to find an emperor who was really just a ghost of his ancestors. Bahadur Shah Zafar was old, he was frail, he had no real power, but now he had a whole army of defiant soldiers at his door. He didn't really have a choice but to give them his blessing, and just like that, a mutiny had a king and the rebellion had a capital. But a fire this big doesn't just start from a single spark. You have to look at the fuel that had been piling up for years, for decades really, just waiting for something to set it off. This one word, Farangi, it tells you so much. It started out as just a word for foreigner, but by this point, it was dripping with contempt. It shows you this growing feeling that the British weren't just rulers anymore. They were this hostile alien force that was threatening the entire Indian way of life. And this was the spark, the rumor about the new Enfield rifle cartridges. It spread like wildfire, and it turned out to be true. See, to load the rifle, you had to bite the end of the cartridge off with your teeth, but they were greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindus, the cow is sacred. For Muslims, the pig is unclean. Forcing them to bite these was seen as this deliberate, evil attack on their deepest religious beliefs, a plot to basically destroy their faith. But those cartridges, they were just the final straw. You can see here, this was decades in the making. The British were taking over kingdoms like Awadh, they were banning ancient social customs, and a real fear was spreading that they were trying to forcibly convert everyone to Christianity. There were even prophecies going around that British rule, which started at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, was destined to end exactly 100 years later. And this chart just lays out the economic damage perfectly. Look at what they did in Awadh. The local landlords, called talukadars, controlled about 67% of the villages. The British came in with a new policy and poof, that number gets slashed to 38%. In one move, they basically created a whole class of powerful, influential, and very angry enemies who had just lost everything. This is so important to understand. What kicked off with soldiers didn't stay with soldiers for long. It became something so much bigger. It became a rebellion of the people. The rebellion just rolled across North India like a tidal wave. As soon as Delhi fell to the rebels, that was the signal. Military bases all over the region rose up. But then ordinary people, farmers, landlords, shopkeepers, started pouring out of their villages to join in. This wasn't a mutiny anymore. It was a full-blown popular revolt. And the leaders who stepped up were from all walks of life. You had the old guard, people like Nana Sahib in Kanpur, and the legendary warrior queen Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. But you also had local leaders, even a tribal farmer named Gonu. This just goes to show you that this was a fight that had really deep roots, with support bubbling up from the ground level. So what was the end game? What were they all fighting for? Well, if we look at the proclamations they issued, we get a really fascinating idea of the world they wanted to build. Take a look at this. The Azamgarh Proclamation. It's basically a revolutionary mission statement. It's a direct appeal to every single group in society. It promised landowners they'd get their land and their dignity back. It promised merchants they wouldn't have to deal with British monopolies anymore. It promised public workers better pay and respect. It's his powerful call for unity, a vision to throw out the foreigners and bring back a world that made sense to them. So it's pretty clear, right? The rebels weren't just angry about one or two things. They were fighting to completely tear down what they called the Ferengi Raj, this foreign system that they felt had just walked all over their religion, their jobs, their traditions, their honor. But an empire like Britain's wasn't going to go down without a fight. And when it struck back, its response was absolutely terrifying in its scale and its cold-blooded brutality. The British moved fast, and not just with soldiers, but with laws. They basically created a legal machine for revenge. They threw out normal court procedures, put all of North India under martial law, and get this, they gave any British person the power to punish suspected rebels. The message couldn't have been clearer. If you rebel, you die. No trials, just payback. This image, it's just haunting. This is Secunderabad in Lucknow, and it shows you what that payback looked like. After a huge battle here, the British didn't just kill the 2,000 or so rebels inside. They left their bones to rot out in the open. This was pure psychological warfare, a horrifying, silent warning to anyone even thinking about fighting back. Even the executions were turned into a horrifying show. Rebels would be tied to the mouth of a cannon and literally blown to pieces in front of crowds. This wasn't just punishment, it was a performance, a terrifying spectacle designed to crush people's spirits and burn the consequences of rebellion into their memory forever. The fighting on the ground eventually stopped, but a different kind of war began right away. A war over the story itself. A battle of images and memories that still shapes how we see 1857 today. Back home in Britain, the newspapers and artists went into overdrive to sell the war to the public. They basically created two main stories. In one, you have heroic British soldiers saving innocent women and children. In the other, like this cartoon of the British lion, you see their vengeance as this totally justified response to a savage, inhuman enemy. These images made the brutality seem necessary and reinforced the whole idea of empire. But in India, a completely different story was being written. The leaders of the revolt weren't seen as villains at all. They became the first martyrs, the first freedom fighters. People like the Rani of Jhansi were celebrated in poems and songs, turned into these incredible heroes who stood up to a tyrant. They became the inspiration for the generations that would eventually win India's independence. And that really leaves us with this final, massive question. The events of 1857 were this brutal, messy, complicated collision of worlds. So when we look back, through all the smoke and all the propaganda from both sides, how do we figure out what really happened? Who was a rebel? And who was a hero? The answer, it seems, really depends on which side of the story you're telling.
All right, let's get right into it. For about 3 decades, from 1915 all the way to 1948, the story of India's fight for freedom. Well, you really can't tell that story without talking about one man, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. This is all about how he managed to turn a struggle of the elites into a full-blown revolution of the masses.
Just take a look at this incredible image. I mean, that's not just a crowd, it's a sea of people. It's an entire nation waking up. This was the scene at the Salt March in 1930, which became one of the most iconic moments of defiance against the British Empire. You can almost feel the tension and the hope in the air, can't you?
And that brings us to the big question, doesn't it? How did one single person, armed with an idea, not weapons, convince an entire subcontinent to peacefully stand up to one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack here.
So our story really kicks off in 1915. A 46-year-old lawyer named Gandhi comes back to India after spending 2 decades in South Africa. Now, it was over there that he really developed his unique philosophy of nonviolent protest, what he called satyagraha. But the India he came back to, well, it wasn't quite ready for him. And he wasn't yet the Mahatma, the great soul that everyone would come to know.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. See, back then, the Indian National Congress was pretty much a movement of well-off professionals, lawyers, doctors, landlords. The whole conversation was happening in fancy drawing rooms, totally disconnected from the farmers and factory workers. And then, at the opening of the Banaras Hindu University in 1916, Gandhi gets up and basically drops a bombshell. He tells this entire establishment that they have it all wrong. So get this, he's speaking to an audience of princes and wealthy patrons, people literally dripping in jewels, and he tells them to take it all off. This wasn't just a speech, it was a total declaration of his intent. He was making it crystal clear that from now on, the poor, the peasants, the vast, silent majority of Indians were going to be at the very center of the freedom struggle.
And here's the thing about Gandhi. He didn't just talk, he acted. The next few years, from 1917 to 1922, are all about him taking his ideas from the podium and bringing them to the people. He starts building a movement from the ground up, one local fight at a time. Let's just quickly trace this timeline because it's fascinating. He starts in 1917 with indigo farmers. The next year, he's with textile workers and peasants in his home state. By 1919, he's leading his first All-India campaign, and just 1 year after that, he launches the massive non-cooperation movement. It's a brilliant strategy, right? Start local, prove your methods work, and then scale it up for the entire nation. So how did he connect with millions of people? This slide just says it all. On the left, you've got the traditional leaders, formally dressed, very respectable, but also very separate from the average person. And then you've got Gandhi on the right. He ditched the suit and tie for a simple loincloth. He spent time every single day at the spinning wheel, which was a powerful symbol of self-reliance that connected him directly with the rural poor. He didn't just speak for the people, he looked and lived just like them.
And the response was absolutely electrifying. Non-cooperation wasn't just some passive idea, it was active, widespread defiance. Students walked out of their schools, lawyers boycotted the courts. In 1921 alone, there were almost 400 major strikes. The entire machinery of the colonial government just started to grind to a halt because Indians were simply refusing to take part in their own oppression anymore. But then, just when the movement was at its absolute peak, everything screeched to a halt. In a small town called Chauri Chaura, a protest turned violent. A police station was set on fire, and several policemen were killed. For Gandhi, this was a complete betrayal of his core principle of nonviolence. So without a moment's hesitation, he called off the entire national movement, a decision that just stunned and confused many of his closest followers. So after a few years of focusing on social reform, Gandhi jumped back into the political arena with what would become his most famous campaign of all. It was an absolute masterclass in political symbolism, and it was all centered on something incredibly simple and everyday: salt.
Okay, so before we get into what he did, it's super important to understand how he did it. The heart of his entire method was satyagraha. And this is not passive resistance, it's truth force, or soul force. It's this active, deeply moral, and relentless insistence on truth and justice, but without ever using violence. The whole idea is to change the heart of your opponent, not to crush them.
So, why salt? Of all things, why pick salt? Well, it was tactical genius. See, the British had a total monopoly on making and selling salt, and they taxed it. This was something that affected every single person in India, whether you were rich or poor. It was a universal problem. By targeting the salt tax, Gandhi found one issue that could unite the entire nation against a common injustice.
And this is the result. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi started walking from his ashram on a 240-mile journey to the coastal village of Dandi. 3 weeks later, he got there, and just like you see here, he reached down, picked up a handful of salty mud, and boiled it to make salt. With that one simple, symbolic act, he broke British law and set off a massive, nationwide wave of civil disobedience.
The empire's response was, well, swift and huge. We're talking 60,000 people were arrested, including Gandhi himself. But it didn't matter. The point had been made. The Salt March grabbed the world's attention. Even Time magazine, which at first had mocked him, was now calling him a saint and a statesman.
But you know, history is never that simple. The Salt March didn't just create a straight shot to freedom. The 1930s brought on a whole new set of challenges, and not just from the British, but from within the nationalist movement itself. Some really deep fractures in Indian society started to show.
At a series of conferences in London, a huge conflict came to a head. The brilliant lawyer Dr. B.R. Ambedkar demanded separate electorates for the so-called untouchables, who we now know as Dalits, to make sure they had political representation. Gandhi was fiercely against this. He argued it would basically segregate them forever from the rest of Hindu society and stop the real goal, which was to get rid of untouchability altogether.
But Ambedkar's point of view came from a completely different reality. He argued that without guaranteed political power, his community, which was so oppressed socially and economically, would have no way to protect itself or ever rise up. This wasn't just a political debate. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies on the right way to achieve social justice.
Now fast forward to World War II. With the world in chaos, Gandhi decides this is it. It's time for the final push. In August 1942, he launches the Quit India movement. He was thrown in jail almost immediately, but as you can see from this picture, the movement just exploded without him. It became a genuine mass uprising with a ton of energy from young activists who organized strikes and protests all over the country.
By 1946, it was pretty clear that Indian independence was coming. It wasn't a question of if anymore, but how. And yet the freedom that finally did arrive was born in the shadow of an unbelievable tragedy.
You know, many historians actually call this period Gandhi's finest hour. As the country was just erupting in horrific violence between Hindus and Muslims over the coming partition, Gandhi, now in his late 70s, walked barefoot from village to village, begging for peace. Just look at him in this image, often a lonely figure, trying to hold back a tidal wave of pure hatred.
So when freedom finally arrived on August 15, 1947, Gandhi wasn't in Delhi for the big celebrations. He was in Calcutta, and he was fasting. For him, the division of India into two separate nations wasn't a victory at all. It was a profound failure. It was a freedom that came at an unacceptable price.
And then, just a few months later, on January 30th, 1948, he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist who couldn't forgive him for his constant calls for peace with Muslims. His death sent shockwaves around the entire world, and in the aftermath, as you can see from this popular print, he was almost deified, transformed into the undisputed father of the nation, a martyr for the dream of a united India.
Which leaves us with one final thought. Gandhi's greatest weapon was satyagraha, non-violent resistance. It was an idea so powerful it helped dismantle an empire and went on to inspire people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. So the question for us, really, is in a world still so full of conflict, where do we see the power of that idea, that truth force, at work today?
How do you even begin to write a single rulebook for a brand new nation, especially one that is so vast, so incredibly diverse, and, on top of all that, born from the fire of a violent partition? Well, that was the staggering challenge facing the framers of India's constitution. Okay, let's dive right in.
You really have to get this contrast to understand the story. On one hand, you have this incredible, soaring hope of independence, perfectly captured in Nehru's famous Tryst with Destiny speech. But at the exact same moment, you have the brutal, devastating reality of partition. This is the tightrope they had to walk. Hope and horror all at once. It really set the stage for one of the greatest political experiments in modern history.
So, to really get this, you have to understand the world they were in. The story of the Indian Constitution doesn't begin in a quiet, scholarly library. It begins in chaos. It begins against a backdrop of violence, division, and just profound uncertainty.
Now, what's just wild about this timeline is how it lays that chaos bare. The Constituent Assembly started its work in December 1946. But look at what was already happening. The country was literally on fire. The Great Calcutta Killings had kicked off a year of non-stop rioting. So think about that. While they're inside, debating legal clauses, the nation is being violently torn apart right outside their doors.
And this was the group tasked with forging unity out of all that chaos, the Constituent Assembly.
Now, yeah, it was dominated by the Congress Party, but don't let that fool you for a second. This room was absolutely filled with brilliant minds, with lawyers, scholars, and activists who had fiercely conflicting visions for what India should become.
And yet, somehow, amidst all that violence and all that uncertainty, the framers actually managed to lay out a truly ambitious vision for the new nation. Let's take a look at how they did it.
The heavy hitters in this whole process were people like Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel. And it was Nehru who moved this crucial document, the Objectives Resolution. You can think of it as the mission statement, the North Star for the entire constitution-making process.
And this quote from Nehru just nails their whole mindset. He was crystal clear. This wasn't about cutting and pasting from the American or French constitutions. He was basically saying, whatever we build here, it has to fit the Indian people. It has to feel like it's ours. This was going to be a uniquely Indian document, from the ground up.
So what was actually in this resolution? Well, it laid out these massive core principles. First, an independent sovereign republic. Done. Justice, equality, and freedom for every single citizen. And this was critical. Specific safeguards for minorities and what they called backward classes. It aimed to fuse the ideals of a liberal democracy with a promise of economic justice for all. This was their blueprint.
But, as soon as you lay out a blueprint like that, it brings up some really tough questions. And that brings us to the first major debate, which was about something that sounds simple but is incredibly complex. Who exactly are the people of India?
And that led to this one question that just set the assembly on fire. Should minorities have separate political electorates? In other words, should Muslims only vote for Muslim candidates, Sikhs only for Sikh candidates, and so on? This was a system the British had put in place, and now the new India had to decide whether to keep it. Well, the pushback from nationalists was, to put it mildly, fierce. Sardar Patel didn't mince words. He called separate electorates a poison that the British had deliberately injected into India to divide it. For him and many others, this system was directly responsible for the bloodshed of partition, and to continue it would be an absolute disaster.
And it wasn't just him. Govind Ballabh Pant came at it from a slightly different angle, but he was just as forceful. He argued that this system would be suicidal to the minorities themselves. And why? Because it would permanently isolate them. It would build a political wall around them, guaranteeing they could never become a majority, leaving them feeling frustrated and politically powerless.
But then, a socialist leader named N.G. Ranga gets up and just flips the whole conversation on its head. He basically said, "You're all arguing about the wrong thing." For him, the real minorities weren't defined by religion. They were the masses of this country, the poor, the oppressed, the people so downtrodden that they couldn't even access their basic human rights. He wanted to redefine the entire debate around economics, not religion.
So you can see how these debates about identity and rights lead right into the next big fight, the tension between unity and autonomy. How much power should the central government in Delhi have, and how much should be left to the provinces, the states?
And this side really lays out the two sides of that classic tug-of-war. On one side, you had Team Strong Center, with guys like Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar. They were haunted by the violence of partition and believed that only a powerful central government could stop the country from flying apart. But on the other side, you had voices like K. Santhanam from the South, wanting that a center trying to control everything from Delhi would just be weak and ineffective. He argued that for real progress, the states needed power, and just as importantly, their own money.
So how did they even begin to tackle these enormous clashing ideas? Well, they got organized, like really organized. They didn't just shout at each other in one big room. They created this amazing system of committees, each chaired by a key figure, to systematically break down these huge questions of power, rights, and governance into manageable pieces.
Okay, now we get to what was maybe the most raw, the most emotional, the most divisive debate of them all, the language question. What would be the language of India?
Before things got really heated, Mahatma Gandhi had championed this beautiful idea of a language called Hindustani. What's so interesting is that Hindustani wasn't pure Hindi or pure Urdu. It was a blend, a mix, the language that ordinary people actually spoke. For Gandhi, it was a perfect living symbol of Hindu-Muslim unity.
But yeah, that spirit of compromise, it did not last. The debate turned incredibly aggressive. A member named R.V. Dulekar stood up and declared that anyone in the assembly who didn't know Hindustani wasn't worthy of being there, and they better leave. I mean, can you just imagine the explosion that set off in the room? And this sparked genuine fear.
G. Durgabai, a member from the South, articulated it perfectly. She said that for non-Hindi speakers, all this aggressive propaganda for Hindi cuts at the very root of the provincial languages. They felt like their own rich cultures and languages were being threatened, like they were about to be erased.
So you've got these intense, often bitter arguments about identity, power, and language. How on earth do they land the plane and actually produce a final document? Well, let's look at what was forged in this fire.
Out of all that conflict, out of all that debate, came something truly, truly revolutionary. Universal adult suffrage. One person, one vote. Now, you have to remember, at a time when even established Western democracies had given the right to vote in slow, painful stages, often excluding women or the poor, India gave it to every single adult citizen, all at once. It was this incredible, massive leap of faith in their own people.
And here it is, the moment it all came together. After 11 sessions, 165 days of actual sittings, spread over nearly 3 long years of intense, exhausting debate, the framers signed the Constitution of India into existence. A single rulebook forged from 1,000 arguments and a multitude of voices.
So in the end, what we have isn't some perfect text handed down from the heavens. It's messy, it's human. It's a hard-won compromise born from some of the most difficult arguments a new nation could possibly have. And that really leaves us with the big question, right? If this vision was forged in the fire of debate, what does it take from all of us today to keep that vision alive?